The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. These words from Nietzsche cut through centuries of human conditioning like a blade through silk. But here's what nobody tells you about thinking differently. It's not just intellectually challenging, it's existentially terrifying. You wake up one morning and realize that everything you've been told about success, happiness, and meaning feels hollow. The conversations around you sound like scripts. The dreams people chase feel borrowed. The fears they harbor seem manufactured. And suddenly, you're standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. To think authentically is to risk everything. Society has a beautiful way of rewarding conformity while punishing original thought. We celebrate innovation and creativity in our speeches, but watch what happens when someone actually challenges the fundamental assumptions everyone lives by. They're labeled as difficult, unrealistic, or worse, dangerous. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't want to think differently. They want the comfort of shared delusions. Think about the last time you voiced an opinion that went against popular consensus. Not just a preference about movies or food, but something that challenged how people see reality itself. Did you feel the subtle shift in the room? The way conversations became more careful, more distant? That wasn't your imagination. That was society's immune system kicking in, identifying you as a potential threat to collective comfort. The ancient Greeks had a word for this: ataraxia, the untroubled tranquility that comes from not questioning too deeply. Most people live in this state by default, and they guard it fiercely. They've made an unconscious pact with mediocrity. I won't disturb your beliefs if you don't disturb mine. But you've already broken that pact simply by thinking for yourself. Marcus Aurelius understood this isolation intimately. As an emperor surrounded by thousands, he wrote, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does." He wasn't advocating for ignorance. He was acknowledging that true wisdom often requires stepping outside the echo chamber of collective opinion. The moment you start thinking differently, you begin a journey that has no return ticket. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you know. And most importantly, you can't pretend to find meaning in things that no longer move you. This is both liberation and exile, wrapped in the same experience. Carl Jung spent his life mapping the territories of human consciousness, and he discovered something that most people refuse to acknowledge. The majority of human behavior is driven by unconscious conformity to what he called the collective unconscious. We think we're making individual choices, but we're actually following invisible scripts written by thousands of years of human conditioning. But here's where it gets interesting and lonely. The moment you become conscious of these scripts, you can no longer perform them authentically. It's like watching a magic trick after learning how it's done. The illusion is broken forever. Consider how most people approach major life decisions. They ask, what will others think? What's the normal path? What's expected of me? These aren't inherently wrong questions, but they reveal something profound about human nature. Most people would rather be wrong with the group than right alone. You, however, have started asking different questions. What do I actually think? What path serves my authentic development? What's expected of my deepest self? These questions lead to radically different answers, and radically different answers lead to a radically different life. Søren Kierkegaard called this the difference between the aesthetic, ethical, and religious stages of existence. Most people never leave the first stage, living for immediate pleasure and social approval. Some progress to the second, living by universal moral principles. But very few reach the third stage, living by their own authentic relationship with existence itself. This progression isn't just philosophical, it's practical and visible. Watch how differently you now approach relationships. While others are performing roles, the successful professional, the devoted parent, the loyal friend, you're trying to show up as yourself. This creates an uncanny valley effect in social interactions. People sense something different about you, but they can't quite name it. Your conversations change. You're no longer satisfied with small talk about weather and weekend plans. You want to explore ideas, question assumptions, dive into the contradictions that make life interesting. But most people aren't equipped for this kind of dialogue. They've been trained to stay in shallow waters, and you're inviting them to swim in the deep end. The loneliness isn't just about being misunderstood. It's about operating from a different frequency entirely. It's like being the only person in a room who can hear a particular musical note. You're not superior or inferior, you're just tuned differently. And that difference creates a gap that feels unbridgeable. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote about the higher men. Not better humans, but individuals who've accepted the burden of thinking beyond conventional boundaries. They don't seek this isolation, it seeks them. It's the natural consequence of intellectual honesty in a world that runs on comfortable lies. Here's what no one tells you about human social dynamics. They're designed to eliminate outliers, not through overt aggression, but through something far more subtle and effective: emotional withdrawal. Society has developed sophisticated mechanisms to bring independent thinkers back into line, and the primary weapon is isolation itself. Think about how this plays out in your daily life. You express an unconventional opinion at work, and suddenly you're not invited to informal lunch meetings. You question popular assumptions in social settings, and people start checking their phones more often when you speak. You refuse to participate in collective outrage or enthusiasm, and you become the person others feel they need to explain their behavior to, or worse, avoid entirely. This isn't malicious. Most people aren't consciously trying to punish you for thinking differently. They're protecting themselves from cognitive dissonance. Your presence reminds them that alternatives exist to their carefully constructed worldview, and that reminder is uncomfortable. It's easier to minimize contact than to engage with challenging ideas. Arthur Schopenhauer identified this pattern in his essay on originality. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. But he missed a crucial 4th stage. The people who eventually accept the truth rarely remember or acknowledge who first presented it to them. The original thinker remains isolated even when their ideas become mainstream. Consider how this dynamic plays out in different spheres of life. In professional settings, you become the person who asks uncomfortable questions in meetings, the one who points out that the emperor has no clothes. Your colleagues appreciate your insights privately, but distance themselves publicly. They need those group dynamics to function. You've made yourself expendable by refusing to play along. In family relationships, you become the one who won't participate in traditional holidays the same way, who questions inherited beliefs, who refuses to perpetuate patterns that no longer serve anyone. You're labeled as difficult or ungrateful, not because you're wrong, but because you've disrupted the familiar rhythm of dysfunction that everyone else finds oddly comforting. Even in romantic relationships, thinking differently becomes a barrier. Most people want partners who share their basic assumptions about reality. They want someone who will validate their choices, not challenge them to examine why they made those choices in the first place. Deep compatibility requires shared fundamental beliefs, and if yours have evolved beyond conventional wisdom, your dating pool shrinks dramatically. The social ecosystem needs conformity to function efficiently. It's not a conspiracy. It's an emergent property of group dynamics. Original thinkers represent entropy in a system that depends on predictable patterns. You've become a beautiful but disruptive force, and the system will always try to expel or contain what it can't integrate. This is why many of history's greatest thinkers were either hermits by choice or outcasts by circumstance. It's not that they couldn't connect with others. It's that authentic connection requires mutual understanding, and most people can't or won't meet them at their level of inquiry. But here's what they don't tell you about choosing the path of authentic thinking. The loneliness transforms into something extraordinary. What begins as isolation evolves into the most profound form of freedom you'll ever experience. You discover that being alone with your thoughts isn't exile, it's coming home. Rainer Maria Rilke captured this transformation perfectly. The only Journey is the one within. Once you accept that your intellectual and spiritual development doesn't require external validation, you unlock a level of inner resources that most people never access. You become your own best company, your own most interesting conversation partner, your own most reliable source of meaning. This isn't about becoming antisocial or misanthropic. It's about developing what psychologists call secure attachment to self. You no longer need others to think like you to validate your own thinking. You can appreciate different perspectives without adopting them, engage with conventional wisdom without being constrained by it, love people deeply without requiring them to understand you completely. The paradox is beautiful. The moment you stop needing others to think like you become more capable of genuine connection. You're no longer performing or persuading or defending. You're simply present, offering your authentic self without agenda. Some people will be drawn to this energy. Most won't. Both responses become equally acceptable to you. You start to recognize others who've made similar journeys. There's a quiet recognition that passes between people who've chosen authenticity over approval. You don't need to agree on specifics. You recognize the quality of mind, the willingness to question, the comfort with uncertainty. These connections, though rare, become extraordinarily rich. Your relationship with solitude fundamentally shifts. What once felt like punishment becomes privilege. The silence that used to amplify your sense of isolation now amplifies your capacity for insight. You discover that the most interesting conversations happen between you and existence itself. Books become friends, ideas become companions, questions become adventures. Henry David Thoreau understood this when he wrote, "I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude." He wasn't advocating for hermitage. He was pointing toward a quality of presence that's only accessible when you're not constantly seeking external validation for your internal experience. You begin to see that most people's fear of being alone isn't really about loneliness. It's about facing themselves without distraction. They've never learned to be interesting to themselves, so they depend on others to provide that spark. You've developed the capacity to generate your own light. This is the final stage of thinking differently. You realize it was never about being understood by others. It was about understanding yourself so completely that external validation becomes redundant. You think differently not to be special or superior, but because authenticity demands it. And in that authenticity, you find a kind of belonging that transcends the need for agreement. The price of thinking differently is indeed loneliness. But the reward is something far more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that you've lived according to your deepest convictions, regardless of the cost. In a world of beautiful, comfortable lies, you've chosen the difficult, liberating truth. And that choice, more than any external recognition, makes you fully alive. Welcome to the magnificent isolation of authentic thought. You're not alone because you're wrong. You're alone because you're awake. And sometimes being awake is worth more than being understood.